Did you know that 65% of high potential, high growth startups fail due to founder conflicts? And in fact, of the three big reasons that startups fail, which are running out of money, not finding product market fit, it is founder conflicts that is the biggest problem. This might be one of the reasons that investors care so much about not just founders' individual experience, but also their experience working together. You've probably heard that over 40% of marriages in the US of A end in divorce. So, what's up with all this choosing the wrong person to invest your time in, and how can we make better decisions? Because when it works, it's great. Just look at Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, or Beyonce and Jay-Z. But when it doesn't work, you have a really big catastrophe. As I'm sure anyone that's had businesses go under due to founder problems or been through a divorce will be able to agree with me. So, on the show to help me today is serial entrepreneur, legendary investor who spent 2 seasons on Shark Tank, the one and only Matt Higgins. He also teaches business and entrepreneurship in MIT and has lots of experience with balancing relationships in a business context, as well as personally going through a divorce before then finding someone he's never had a bad day with. And it was really interesting to study and dissect relationships from my psychology lens and his business lens. It's always fun to talk to someone who is crazy successful in one domain. He has a net worth of over $150 million, a good portion of which is due to his successful business partnerships, including his investment firm with Steve Ross, the Miami Dolphins owner, who is worth over $10 billion. So I really loved digging into what are the other tangential things of interest when someone's such an outperformer in one domain. What are the untold stories, the other areas of excellence that actually contribute to their success that you don't really hear? And relationships is, of course, certainly one of them. So, hello and welcome to the Growth Mindset Podcast with me, Sam Webster. And stay tuned for this deep dive into how to really understand partnerships that work in business and life. Now, we start the conversation with the very clear and obvious start point of discussing arranged marriages in Bangladesh, because that's how my brain works. And don't worry, the whole episode will come together. You will learn lots about other relationships in life and business as promised. Stay tuned. I was in Bangladesh for my friend's wedding, and they have a very different mentality around arranged weddings where you don't even know the person and they just make it work, and they burn the boats on having another relationship. They don't get divorced unless like it's crazy abusive or something, which is most of the time not true. And you just have to work it out. Whereas like we have a lot more divorce in the rest of the world because we can.
You make an interesting point, which is the institution largely predicated on the idea that nobody's getting out because you're commingling everything, right? Like, there's somebody said till death do you part, because it's really complicated to make you part. But I don't know. I hadn't thought about burn the boats in that context.
It definitely was fascinating to be out there and just how relaxed my friend was about marrying someone he didn't know. And
You got to give a little more scene setting. When did you hear for the first time?
it's quite interesting. They have sort of like a Tinder, but used by each other's parents. It's somewhere between Tinder and LinkedIn, where they kind of have like a CV of each person, and then you can read about each other. And he got to meet her like twice just to check that it wasn't completely wrong.
How much data at CV? I'm curious.
So the data is more like where they went to school, what are they good at, rather than what are they passionate or interested in. Now, you didn't even like nothing about like music taste or what they like to do as such, and more like she was very good at her degree on this thing. And a lot of data on all her different uncles and what they do with their jobs, which is also, I would have thought, irrelevant for whether I would want someone to be my wife, but apparently it's useful.
What's fascinating about that, I do think about this topic a lot. So I actually met my wife on a dating app, and she put almost like an FBI composite sketch of her core attributes. It was a list of like 20 qualities, and it sort of stood out, but I still remember them. They were like really good with power tools, great parallel parker, loves math. If you were to take a step back, if she was being calculated, it would be the perfect composite sketch of the cool girl who is like, but I don't need anybody to make me happy. Certainly not a man. And I remember when I read this, thinking it triggered all sorts of intellectual responses of like, for some reason, I think this is the perfect mate. And I had to lobby her to get together with me, and finally I was like, trust me, if we get together and you are who you say you are, we're never going to have a bad day. And we got together. And I'm telling you, I haven't had a bad day in 10 years since that together. So I'm wondering if there's something about that curation note, because we're conditioned to believe romance and love is like, it's not calculated or curated. I'm just wondering if we're shortchanging that Tinder and there's more data there than we realize that is telling people. But I mean, I have no idea. I'm just giving you my little case study of that ended up being remarkable choice because there was so much actual data in there that I could use.
Yeah, I do feel like most love at first sight claims are just wrong. But it's also a bit like when I'm trying to learn to sing or something, how bad I am at pitching the right note. But if I do get it, I know that I've got it, but I still can't hear it properly. And I'll spend the same way, like you can chase someone thinking that you're kind of right, but there's something not quite right where you don't know what it is at all. And you're like almost there. But yeah, like the few times you do get it right, you do really notice.
A lot of the chemical reaction that is called like love at first sight is actually us seeking something inside of ourselves that we lack. And then we feel that energy extra and we want to grab it as like the two halves of a whole. I also don't think opposites attract. Actually, I think that's not true. And so I think that is a proxy for the soul yearning or feeling inadequate and be like, oh, you've got it. I want to capture it. I'm not being very romantic about that.
Also, doesn't have to be like exactly identical. I think there's an important difference in like shared values versus identical values.
Nope.
As in, like Einstein, his first wife, she like helped him write his papers. She like studied on the same course as him. She was like crazy thing, but like she also wanted to be Einstein. She wanted a Nobel Prize. She just didn't want to be a mother. She had like identical values, not shared values. Whereas his second wife was, she didn't care about physics, didn't play the violin, like, wasn't interested in what he did, but just like liked having a life with him and had the shared values of building a life, which was a nice example, I guess, of that
By the way, this
concept.
is probably the most important part of our podcast, to be honest. Like, I actually think it dictates everything. In my class at Harvard, and I teach moving beyond direct to consumer, and I bring in often tandems, co-founders, and the students are always fascinated by this. Top 5 topics they're most interested in this because a lot of them are imagining starting their own business, and they're always wondering, how do you choose a co-founder? And what's interesting is they presume, I love this, every year it's the same reveal. They presume that you choose a co-founder by identifying something you lack, but something you need to make a successful whole. And you choose somebody who represents that. So you're like, I'm the marketing person, but I'm not a numbers guy or woman. I need somebody who can do that. And that's how you choose a co-founder. And yet the most successful co-founders will always give the same answer. They'll say, nope, you choose a co-founder based on actually value overlap because businesses success or failure are determined when things go wrong. And when you don't have the same values, you don't approach crisis the same way, and then it destroys the company. Whereas if both of you happen to be marketing people, like you'll just hire a CFO. But if you don't have the same values, and I think marriage is the same thing. I love the way you said it. It's not identical values, it's overlap on that which matters most to you fundamentally. It's like love adventure, you know, respond to crisis with flexibility, right? Like cancel plans on a whim. Those things all actually boil down to sort of values. And I have found that that is more important. And oftentimes when people say opposites attract, they're also talking opposites around something fundamental, like they don't like to go to parties and I do. I think value like in business and in relationships is really important.
Definitely on the opposites, as in there can be some attraction based on like if you're not a big speaker, someone that like talks all the time can be really nice for it, make your first few dates go really well. And they're like, yeah, they listen to me all the time, but it actually gets really bad over time because of if I'm not confident at speaking much, I'll just never get heard at all with someone that speaks all the time. And you get super bored of that person. That person won't actually really know you or like, care about your thoughts either. And like 3 months later, it just sort of implodes as opposed to even though the first date's good.
If we're making it hard, you'd be like, all right, value overlap, although not identical. And then below that, our attributes can have opposites, but to the extent to which an attribute is the opposite, it should be one that both of you admire. So, like, my wife is the most regulated human being I've ever met. She's also the most physically talented person. She can build a house with her bare hands. I can't tie my shoes. And so I bring her the Dunkin' Donuts when she's managing the bricklayers. And I think it's the hottest thing in the world. So I'm in awe of my wife and her competence in these areas. But if I disdained it, like, why are you doing that? It's such a waste of time. Like, you bricklayer. So I do think to the extent to which you have skills, you should be in awe of them or at least admire them. I love the way you just said it. You're like, oh God, you talk so much. It's so annoying that it eventually erodes the relationship because it's very invalidating. And then the other person has two things: one, fight you or suppress who they really are. And then eventually they find somebody sympathetic to who they are. This is a fun non sequitur segue kind of away from burning boats, but I'm building bridges.
I guess it's still related. It was not at all where I was like quite expecting to go. I have just done a season on relationships, so maybe I just got like a few of these things still stuck in my head. So, how long was it before you knew that she could become your wife?
That's a very interesting question. We always got along so fundamentally well that getting along so well felt foreign, almost potentially problematic. So it took a minute to be like, it's supposed to be hard. It's not supposed to be easy. We're just, I think we are conditioned to believe that relationships are hard work. And I have to be honest, it's just hasn't been hard work. And I mostly spend my days like enamored in it all. And so it took a bit, to be honest. I know that sounds so bizarre. And then we just morphed into the closest of friends. And then we got married. This is like 4 years. You begin to realize that true love is grounded in admiration and mutual respect and companionship and friendship and shared values, and not by friction or like cortisol, which can feel sometimes erotic, right? But actually, at the end of the day, is ultimately destructive. And so I think we're not taught that, right? We're not taught to marry your best friend. And no one like says that because it sounds unromantic. And in fact, it's the most romantic thing you could ever imagine, right? Like, my days are filled with joy and travel together and do things together. It's like I get to hang out with my best friend. So, but we're not taught that. Go find your best friend.
There's also a big stigma, well, big expectation around just sort of sexiness rather than companionship.
Well, look how we analyze Ben Affleck and Jennifer Lopez, but look how that story resonates, right? We're all like, oh my God, get back together. They were separated by circumstances. There's no emphasis on like, why did they break up in the first place? You know what I mean? Like, yeah, we've all been down that road, right? Well, there's a reason, maybe. I have no idea, and I'm not judging. I'm just sort of fascinated by that is a narrative that is very like, reunited love as opposed to movies about your best friend.
Mm, yeah, for sure. Interesting. In terms of relationships, then, and also business lessons and where this might come in, burn the boats and things, and just general trauma, have you heard much about attachment styles? Because I found them quite interesting. But then I was wondering if that also relates at all to how you might then operate in a business and also your
Let-
fundamental relationship with risk and stuff.
Let's break down what you mean by attachment style in like a non-clinical sense.
In attachment theory, there's three main attachment styles and like a fourth, but predominantly most people are a secure attachment style where they kind of were brought up with love and they feel okay with expressing their emotions. And then you have like the insecure attachment, anxious style, where they maybe didn't always get consistent love and they aren't sure if it's going to come back to them and they need a lot of reassurance. Or you have avoidance that we're taught that like emotions are bad and that they shouldn't be displaying emotions and they're very independent and they kind of like will pull away from relationships when they feel like they're getting too like cohabity. And I'm just wondering if, because you can definitely see just relationships to risk and stuff when you're just unsure if things are going to work out for you, that you would be more insecure in things. And I was just wondering if there's anything that sort of has been studied of how people find the right sort of people to work with based on their attachment styles on loving relationships as well.
I think it's 100% true and relevant in the business context. And I think for me personally, having sort of overseen so many companies and deal with these issues, it comes up all the time. And I try not to introduce the clinical words because then it gets people feel like they're condemned, right? Like your attachment style, mom, and there's nothing about it. But I use the language in a colloquial sense and I see it all the time. So what do I mean by that? I find that a leader who is afraid to be scrutinized oftentimes comes back because it's not safe. They feel like if they are scrutinized and they're inadequate, they're going to be rejected or things are going to fall apart. And as a result, they focus a lot on concealment or vilifying someone who is challenging them. And so there's a great phrase. I won't say it in Italian, but I love it. It anchors a lot of my business investing philosophy. The fish rots from the head, right? And when I find a business that is struggling downstream, I usually can trace it all the way back up to the top. oftentimes around an attachment style, even if left unstead. And so, how does that show up in a business? If you have a leader that is afraid to be scrutinized or face something, some inadequacy because of those residual childhood issues, they're going to create a culture where it's not invented here syndrome, where they reject anything that comes externally because that means that it's a referendum on their inability to create it, right? So you create a whole culture that is rejecting the competition as opposed to learning from what's happening. So how I approach all these issues in business, attachment style, or really in a bigger way, refusing to embrace self awareness, right? Refusing to accept criticism or self audit is try to identify like, what is it about the leader that is making them feel unsafe so that they are looking without instead of looking within? Because the unlocks are usually within. I try to identify, and usually it's a moment of crisis that creates the opening. I talk in my book in chapter 8. It's my favorite part of the entire book. It's also a top favorite part of my entire business experience. I tell the story of a bartender named Aiden, Irish bartender, who was struggling. I had acquired his business. And he is what I call a martyr in a leadership context where they've defined success as being required to take it all upon themselves. They're predestined to just assume the load. And usually the reason is because they're afraid to actually deal with friction of holding people accountable. There's lots of reasons why people become a martyr. But the bottom line is he was a martyr, and a martyr doesn't scale. And eventually we took him private equity money and he started stumbling and the cracks started showing up everywhere and he had put on a lot of weight. And then he calls me tears and he's like, I'm so sorry, man. Like I'm out. Like I'm failing and I'm going to quit and bought this company. And I hear a beeping in the background and it's and I said, what is that sound? Because I'm in a hospital. My daughter's on a machine. We're trying to see if she has epilepsy. She's got seizures. And I'm like, why are you calling me? And he's like, I don't know, man, it's over. And I'm like, first of all, I'll tell you when it's over. I'm perfectly comfortable making this phone call. You need to hang up and you need to like face the fact that none of this shit matters. And he doesn't call me back for a few days, calls me back. And he's like, I needed to acknowledge the possibility that it could all go to hell and I would still be fine. I'm ready to do the work. And I'll skip the part, but this is relevant to what you just asked me. I do this all the time. There's an industrial psychologist, an organizational psychologist I've been working with since I was like 26. She came in, started working with him, tell a story in the book. And he just embraces this culture of self awareness, so much so that he shared the report about all that was wrong with him. And 19 months later, he sells what was a zero for 9 figures. And it's a heroic story. None of it is fictionalized. And I share that because I still don't know why he was stuck personally. I know it goes back many, many years, but by addressing whether it was attachment style or whatever it is, he was able to unlock himself and then unlock the company and then change the trajectory of all these people's lives. Now, people will say to me, okay, Matt, that sounds great. How do you mentor a CEO to become more self aware? And I said, the only tactic I know that works for sure is modeling vulnerability in a very cringy way. Because when somebody else sees that you could share things like you have one testicle, like we're doing now, or write an entire book or talk about a divorce, which I would love not to talk about and for you never to ask me those questions. When you model that and that it's still okay, that person takes the first step towards self awareness. So I'm always trying to create space for that so people can mirror it. Doesn't always work when people are too far gone or a little bit, not to use clinical terms, but narcissistic or closed off, then it doesn't quite work, but usually it works. People do it. Yeah, I remember meeting with Aiden when we had a breakthrough. Aiden, like, he made all these assumptions about me, who I was, and wealth and put together, and I'm an executive. He's a little younger. And I started sharing like these stories about like taking care of my mother and how I'm completely not fully adjusted yet. And I used to want to drive that car into a tree many nights. He didn't know all that when that was actually, this is the first time I realized that was the beginning of his journey. That I planted the seeds of a breakthrough because he couldn't believe I was sharing that. And all these misperceptions he had about who I was as a leader began to melt away. I created space for him to begin to be vulnerable that didn't show up for 2 years after that conversation.
Okay, thank you so much for listening to the conversation. Apologies for the slightly harsh cut at the end there. The interview that we played today was really just a segment of a much larger interview that I did with Matt around his book that he's releasing called Burn the Boats and outlining the ways that we sabotage our primary goal by making backup plans. If you want to hear more about that, then we do have the full episode available that was released 2 months ago, and it's full of his execution insights. To be honest, we were supposed to be talking about that for the whole conversation, but I got him rather excited as well as myself, and we did really enjoy this giant tangent into relationships And I hope you did too. If you know somebody who is pondering who could be right for their next endeavor in business or love, well, do send them this episode to remind them to just give up on finding love and just get an arranged marriage because it works. Now, if you enjoyed the podcast, then feel free to drop me a comment so it's not just my mum commenting. And if you are my mum, then do please keep commenting. I tell you what, people, you've really got to work for a podcast comment. On YouTube, all the comments, so easy. The podcast isn't really built for it. I should probably stop asking for comments. Let's move on quickly. Uh, Take it easy. Remember, life is too short to have your business ruined by an idiot you shouldn't be working with. And when it comes to marriage, well, as the great George Washington says, it's far better to be alone than in bad company. So be kind to yourself, smile at strangers, and don't get caught up in the wrong relationships.